Does truth exist?
Because you have faith, does that make this book true?
Does God exist?
So when someone says there is no truth, if you apply the claim to itself, what should you say? Is that true? They don't think Christianity's true. They're talked out of it. You know why they're talked out of it? Because they've never been talked into it.
Cross-examining skeptical and atheistic views. Welcome to Cross-Examine with Dr. Frank Turek.
We've never done this on this program before, ladies and gentlemen, and I imagine very few radio programs have done what we're going to do today, because we're going to have an actual cold case homicide detective on with us to talk about what is good evidence, and are the events of the New Testament, do they count as good evidence? Do we have good evidence to really believe that the events described in the New Testament actually occurred? Now, this is really an historical question, or a question of forensics, and there's no better way to look at that than through the eyes of someone that has been doing this every day in California for the past 25 years. You may have heard of the city of Torrance, California. Torrance, California came to my psyche recently when I read the story of Louis Zamperini. Some of you have read the book Unbroken. I don't have time to get into the theme of that book now, but it's a fabulous read. And Louis Zamperini is from Torrance, California, and so is my guest today, and that is J. Warner Wallace, who wrote a brand new book. And when I say brand new, ladies and gentlemen, this thing has just come out this January, just a few days ago, actually. It's called Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. Now, J. Warner Wallace, you may have heard before if you're a student of apologetics. He has a fabulous website called PleaseConvinceMe.com. That's PleaseConvinceMe, all one word, .com. He's also substituted several times for Greg Kokel on the Stand to Reason broadcast. And in fact, he's joining Stand to Reason as he retires from the Torrance Police Department this year. And he's going to continue with PleaseConvinceMe.com. So you may have heard of him before, but if you haven't, you're in for a treat. Jim, thanks for being on the show today.
Wow, I don't think I've ever heard anybody intro me with the city of Torrance, which is pretty cool. I've forgotten that Louis Zamperini, of course he is, homegrown in Torrance. So I guess we do have some claim to fame, don't we?
You do. You have some claim to fame, and
Yeah.
as we know, Louis Zamperini, for those of you that don't, well, maybe some of you don't know, he's a Christian. He's about 95 years old now. He was a World War II hero, World War II Japanese POW. The brilliant book Unbroken is something you all ought to read. He actually came to faith through a Billy Graham crusade a number of years ago. But we're not talking about Louis today. We're talking about you, J. Warner Wallace, and this new book is fabulous. And I want you to give a little bit of a background on how you got to doing cold case homicides, Jim. How did that happen?
Well, I was lucky. I mean, there's not a lot of agencies in Southern California that have a dedicated cold case team just because of financial resources, especially in the economy we're in right now. But we had a six-man homicide team. We were responsible for all the, we call them fresh homicides that occur. Every sixth one would be yours, and you'd work with the other detectives in your team on the other five until you got to your turn again. And this is how we typically worked for years, and we would assign the unsolved homicides. That's what cold cases are. They're unsolved homicides because there's no statute of limitations on homicides. They stay open. And so we would have these old cases in our city that just had not been solved going back to about 1970 or so, and we identified those, and we would each work one of those kind of as a collateral duty. We would say, okay, look, when you have a time, in between your other duties, if you can, do some interviews, do what you can to move these other cases forward. And that, for the most part, was not productive. And so eventually they established a team. And I was lucky enough to be a part of that team. So
now, how many cases would you say over your 25-year career have you worked on cold case cases?
Well, I'd say we only had probably about 30 or 32, 33 now that are still we would consider to be open homicides. Every year you solve some homicides, and some homicides stay open. So the collection, you close some, and some come on your list. So you're stuck with always about 30 or so. Mm-hmm. And so we've looked at all of those, and each case takes about 2 years to work. So I've done now 6, but that means that you're looking at 12 years of work that really I wish I could do it faster, but I've had some cases that I actually arrested the suspect in these cases, 3 or 4 years ago. Then we still haven't even gone to trial. And during that time between arrest and trial, you're doing a lot of work preparing the case, and you're responding to the requests of the DA and those kinds of things. So they are cumbersome. And that's why I think a lot of agencies just don't bother, if they don't have the resources to be able to do it.
So, Jim, are you saying that these cases aren't normally solved in 42 minutes like we see on TV?
Yeah, I know. As a matter of fact, I've been approached by a number of producers, television producers, who want to do like cold case series, where they say, hey, we want to do a real life, cold case thing where we'll find the cases and we'll bring them to you and we'll give you a week, and each week you'll solve one case. And I'm thinking to myself, please. It takes me a week just to kind of get the old materials assembled and to collect all the old evidence out of the property room. There's no way you can do a case in a week. You could look at a case and tell you what might, you can give some advice to somebody in a week, but there's no way you could get it from start to finish in a week.
Now, some of your cases, and you personally have been on the NBC show called Dateline, correct?
Yes, we get a feature there occasionally because these are unusual cases and they're emotional cases when they don't go solved, not solved for a number of years, and so they draw a lot of public attention.
Now, it turns out that you use all your expertise, and for our listeners, know that Jim has a long history on the police force right through his father. His father was on the police force for many years. He has been on for 25 years, and now his son is actually on the police force as well. So he has a lot of allegiance to police work and a lot of experience in it. And when you put this book together, Jim, called Cold Case Christianity, How a Homicide Detective Investigates the Claims of the Gospels, you've done something that I don't think anybody else has done in any book, and that is in the first half of the book, you lay out 10 principles for discovering what good evidence is. It's called Learn to be a Detective. 10 important principles every aspiring detective needs to master. Now, obviously, we don't have time to go through all of these, but how did you come up with these 10? Is this just based on your experience? Is it based on official training, a combination of both? How did you come up with these?
Well, a lot of it is error. If you step on this thing enough times the wrong way, you eventually learn how to walk carefully through the crime scene. And so I think a lot of it is just mistakes that you make, and then finding out, well, boy, that seemed to work better. And if I take a broader approach and I have a certain kind of template or a strategy that I use in certain kinds of cases, so that's kind of what I think has happened. And as I got to be the old guy, when I started, I was 15 years junior to the next guy I was working with. And so these guys were all like, I was in awe of these people. And so we would walk into crime scenes and I would just shut up. I would just kind of watch what they would do. And then as you eventually become that old man and everyone else retires and you're the last guy standing, people look to you to say, hey, what should be my, not so much how should I do this today on this case, but what should my overall kind of principled strategy be as I approach this kind of case? And so you try to pass those on to your guys who are junior to you. And so a lot of that is just stuff that I've had to either sit down in conversation with my coworkers, or I've got on the whiteboard and said, okay, here's the approach we should take, and kind of penciled it out for everybody. And eventually there'll be somebody else doing that because I'm the guy. I'm sure I gleaned a lot of this from the guys who came before me, and I'm sure that same thing will happen once I'm gone. So a lot of it is just learned,
This first half of the book is something that, the whole book everyone needs to read, but the first half of the book I think is unique to Christian apologetics because I don't think it's been done before. The way you've basically answered the question, what is good evidence and how do you evaluate the evidence in the first half of the book. Then in the second half of the book, you go on to examine the evidence from the New Testament in light of those principles. And so this is it's a very easy to read book too because you put cases, you've changed the names in them, but you've put real cases in the book so people can get a sense of an illustration from a real world situation of how this principle that you put forth is used. And then later on you apply it to the New Testament. So this is very good work. And unfortunately, you couldn't get anyone to endorse it. I mean, you got no names on here like Rick Warren and Lee Strobel. How did that happen?
Well, I got saved at Rick's church, and this goes to show you that God's using Rick to reach stubborn atheists like me who walk.
You were an atheist.
Yeah, I was 35 and I was pretty committed. I had no interest in really in even accepting the possibility that God existed. I mean, I had absolutely no interest at all. And I was, I would go from completely dispassionate to angry about it, depending on who I was talking to. And most of the time, it wasn't that I was angry at Christians or Christianity. So I was angry. Sometimes not. I was just I was not a patient person, let's put it that way. So that kind of had to change, and Rick's one of those guys who can help you do that.
Absolutely. All right, we're talking to J. Warner Wallace, the author of the new book, Cold Case Christianity. You need to have it. You're not going to believe some of the stories we're going to talk about in the rest of this broadcast, so don't go away. You're listening to Cross-Examined with Frank Turk on the AFR Talk Radio Network, back in 2. Welcome back to Cross-Examined with Frank Turek on the AFR Talk Radio Network. Our website, crossexamined.org. That's cross-examined with a D on the end of it.org. We present evidence for Christianity and cross-examine ideas against it. Also do a lot of work on college campuses. For those of you out in California, I'll be at San Jose State on, when am I going to be there? That's going to be January 28th and 29th. I'll also be at a church in Fulton, California, which is north of the Bay Area. So check the website, crossexamined.org, for more on that. My guest today is J. Warner Wallace. He's written the book called Cold Case Christianity. He is a homicide detective, a cold case homicide detective with the Torrance, California Police Department. And this book is a brilliant new book that shows you what good evidence is and how to detect good evidence, and then applying those principles to the New Testament events. And Jim, I'm looking at around page 76 or so of your book. You give, in a section talking about testing your witnesses, which is one of the principles you say is a principle you ought to do if you want to be a good detective. You right. Give a story in the beginning of this chapter that appears to have completely contradictory testimony to an event, and yet you say it's not contradictory, it's complementary. Can you explain that story and how it relates to the New Testament?
I think what happens is that people typically experience, hang on one second, I've got some background noise, sorry, Frank.
That's all right.
People, I think, typically experience this when they work investigations, especially if you work investigations that are common, and murders aren't as common, let's say, as robberies. And I worked robberies for a number of years, and I can tell you, after working these robberies, that I got to talk to thousands and thousands of witnesses, and many times a number of multiple witnesses on the same case. And so you get a chance to kind of get perspectives on how witnesses behave in certain settings and what might lead witnesses to say the exact same kind of thing or variations of the same thing. And so I've had a number of, and this is, I got to tell you, when I first got saved, part of it was that I was looking through the Gospels and identifying aspects of the Gospels that were very similar to the kinds of attributes I would see when multiple eyewitnesses would see the same event. They would have what I would call kind of unintentional eyewitness support. And you might talk to the first witness and you think, oh my gosh, how did it even happen? Was this person even there? I mean, how did they even see that? I mean, I know enough about what happened that I can't even imagine this person's accurate in what they're describing. And the next person will come along and say something that clarifies then what the first person said. But if you compared the two statements, you might think they were describing two separate events in terms of how they observed what they observed the suspect to be wearing, or what they observed the suspect to heard the suspect say. And so you think to yourself, wow, this variation is a problem. But really, this is what I've come to expect in every event that's seen by eyewitnesses. When there are multiple eyewitnesses, I expect there to be apparent contradictions that I'm going to have to kind of sort through and figure out why they are, in fact, both correct about what they're saying, and why these two statements are complementary rather than contradictory.
And the story you give a robbery situation where one witness sees it completely different from the other, and yet they both saw the same event, yet they all agree on the central event. There was a robbery. Can you get into that a little bit?
And I've had a couple of these that were very, very different in terms of, I've got basically it's a robbery of a liquor store, and the robbery occurs in such a way that there's a couple of things you've got to take into account. Number one, what is the physical perspective of each person involved? These two people I described were Sylvia and Paul, both observed the same robbery. They have a very different kind of demographic background and a cultural background. Sylvia was an older woman, not older, I say older, younger than me, but she was about in her late 30s, early 40s. She was married. She had children. She had a certain professional status in her career. She She was simply there at a liquor store. This liquor store happened to also carry some grocery products to pick up some milk on her way home from work. And Paul was in a very different position. He was a young guy. He was a friend of the person who was robbed at the teller, the clerk behind the counter. A single guy, didn't have any kids. He was basically there just visiting this cashier. He was on a day off. The cashier was actually working. And he was in a different position in the store when the actual robbery occurred. Now, of course, their positions in the store allowed them to see some things and not see other things. But more importantly, their background influenced what they saw. I'll give you an example of this. Sylvia is watching this, and she's able later on to tell me with great detail about the kind of shirt that the suspect is wearing. He's wearing an Izod polo shirt of a particular color, a particular style. If you ask Paul about this, he's like, I think he wore a T-shirt. An Izod polo shirt is very different than a T-shirt, but he gives me little or no detail, and when you kind of push him on it, well, come on, man, what do you think he was wearing? A T-shirt? Well, he's not wearing a T-shirt, and that was not his focus. It was her focus only because she was familiar with that brand of classic Izod, because there were guys in her office who wore that shirt all the time. She was in a professional office, and she recognized the brand, herself. She actually had even purchased one of these for her husband, so she was familiar with the kind of shirt it was. At the same time, if I asked her about the weapon, I mean, it's a very different story. Now, Paul had great information about the weapon. He was able to tell me it's a Ruger P95. Now, that's a very specific recollection of the kind of weapon it is, but he's in a place to see something that she can't see, and he's got a familiarity. He's interested in this. He's a gun nut, and he's interested in this kind of thing, so he's able to give me great detail. But even beyond that, one of these two, Sylvia, says, I don't think they had a vehicle at all. And the other guy, Paul's telling me he thought they ran to a 90s tan Nissan. I'm telling you, if you would have just listed the descriptions offered by Sylvia and the descriptions offered by Paul, you would swear they're talking about two different robberies altogether. But, of course, when you start to synthesize these two together and understand where they're coming from, not just where they're standing in the room, but where are they standing in life? What is their background, their personal narrative? What is the perspective about certain things? You start to understand why they were focused on some issues, not on others, why they saw things a certain way. So it's up to me. It's a kind of a burden for me as a detective to know more. I can't just sit there and say, okay, what'd you see, and leave it at that. I have to kind of ask, what are you about? What's your background? Because I'm later on going to figure out why it is they're describing things a certain way. And it's going to go beyond just learning about what they saw. Who are you, and how did that influence what you saw? That's important for me.
You know, Jim, critics of the New Testament, by the way, we're talking to J. Warner Wallace, his new book, Cold Case Christianity. He's a cold case homicide detective. You need to get this book. But, Jim, critics of the New Testament will say, well, look, there's contradictory, it appears, claims in these documents about the resurrection. For example, who got to the tomb first, how many angels were at the tomb, these kind of things. And they tend to discredit the accounts, so we ought not believe them. You say what?
Well, I'm going to say this to you. It's something kind of controversial. I think we as Christians, we usually will stand behind this idea of inerrancy in Scripture. But I don't for a second believe I need inerrancy in order to trust something as reliable. It turns out the standard for determining whether or not a witness is actually reliable and to be trusted is much, much, much lower than inerrant. I'm looking for eyewitness reliability. In my cases, I can tell you there are times when witnesses are wrong about particular details, flat wrong. I'm not talking about they appear to be contradictory. There are times when they're just wrong. And we have a jury instruction for jurors in this situation to say, hey, just because a witness might be wrong about a particular detail, if you can come to understand why they might be wrong about that, but right about everything else, you can still embrace their testimony as reliable. So there are times in which, in a court case, in a criminal case, even if Paul or Sylvia were wrong about a particular detail, you might be able to say, well, yeah, because she was standing over here, and there's no way she could have seen that, and that's why it's missing from her testimony. If you press her on it, she'll emphatically say, no, I didn't see that, because she didn't see it where she was standing, so I can trust the other stuff, but I can't go to her for that detail. Okay.
In fact, you make the case, and others have made the case as well, that the very fact that there are differences in the details, but agreement about the major event, in our case, the resurrection. Just like in this case you're talking about, everyone agrees there was a robbery. They disagree on, what the guy was wearing or that kind of thing.
Right.
But you point out that is actually what you find on these on these homicide investigations, that enhances the credibility of these eyewitnesses.
Yeah,
true?
absolutely. I had a case where I was a homicide occurred in our town in the middle of the night. It's pouring rain. I get called out. I'm about 50 minutes from my town, so I got to get a suit on. I got to get there. I'm there about maybe an hour and 10 minutes after the fact, and it's just pouring rain. So the patrol officers who are there just tried to do the right thing for the victim, for the witnesses rather, and they put all of them in the back seat of a patrol unit, waiting for me to get there. The same patrol unit. So when I get there, I've got a problem. I've got 3 witnesses who now have been talking to each other for an hour. And not only have they've talked each other out of the contrary details, they've talked each other out of important perspectives that I want to get. Look, here's what I want when I get there. I want the natural, messy, apparently contradictory, a beautiful mess that is eyewitness statements. This is how they are. And I want all that messiness left in place. I'll figure out why it appears to be messy later. But what I don't want are 3 statements that are all the same with the mess cleared out before I get there. Then I can't trust anything because I should be the one to clear the mess. They don't need to be the ones to clear the mess. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And if the documents that we have with regard to the New Testament, and by the way, as you point out in your book, Cold Case Christianity, it's not just the documents of the New Testament we have that affirm the events of the New Testament, but that's another story.
Right.
Even if there were no variation in the description between these 4 gospels, say, the critics would say collusion.
Right.
Right? But now that there is variation, they're saying, well, they can't be trusted. And you're saying, no, that's exactly what I find as a cold case homicide detective.
Yeah, I think any detective, I know a lot of cops who are still atheists, okay, no problem. I mean, a lot of friends who are not believers. Yeah. But if they really think about the nature of eyewitness testimony, they've worked in any of these cases, they'll have to at least admit one thing. Eyewitnesses never, ever, ever agree. That's a good thing, because if they agreed, we'd suspect they weren't telling us the truth. So a claim, I think most, even the non-believing cops I know, would at least not make this a claim and stand on it. Hey, if there's contradiction between the accounts, you can't trust them as reliable, because that's what we see every day.
And they all agree, these 2 individuals you were talking about here a minute ago, Sylvia and Paul, they both agreed there was a robbery. They just disagreed on minor details that maybe weren't the focus of who they were.
Yeah, I can tell you this. If we're in a robbery together, Frank, and I'm the guy who's got the gun pointed at me, I guarantee you the barrel of that gun in my face is going to affect the way I see the event. Where you're standing to the side 15 feet away, you're going to capture detail that I don't even care. I've had witnesses and victims who were at the barrel of the gun who couldn't even tell me the hair color of the suspect, eye color. They couldn't tell me the essential, simple details because their focus was so, singularly focused on the weapon involved that they didn't look beyond the hand of the suspect. So I think this is pretty natural in these kinds of cases. I think that was never an issue for me that caused me to stumble as a skeptic who was reading through the Gospels. I never felt like that was an issue to concern me.
We're talking to J. Warner Wallace, and when we get back from the break, we're going to get into another case that deals with conspiracy theories, because a lot of people, skeptics out there, think that the New Testament is just an elaborate conspiracy theory, that the apostles got together, made the whole thing up, and we're going to see why that's just not plausible right after the break. You're not going to want to miss it. We're talking to J. Warner Wallace's new book, Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. And by the way, he was an atheist at one point and followed the evidence right to the foot of the cross. Back in 2 minutes. Don't go away. Cold Case Christianity. How a homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. My guest today, J. Warner Wallace. His website, PleaseConvinceMe.com. I urge you to go to that website, PleaseConvinceMe.com. A lot of good material up there. But the main point of today's broadcast is you need to get the book, Cold Case Christianity. It's just out, just beginning of this year, 2013. And we're just hardly scratching the surface of this fine work. And it's a unique work. It's not something anyone else, to my knowledge, has done before. So you need to pick up this book. And Jim, I want to talk a little bit about a chapter you have in the book here, and this is one of the principles of being a good detective. You say resist conspiracy theories, and if there's ever a claim against the New Testament documents, or against the New Testament story, I should say, that many skeptics bring forth, is that this was a great conspiracy theory. Why is that not a good a good claim against the New Testament events?
Yeah, I think a little bit this is kind of an Occam's razor. I think that often I find myself as an investigator realizing that the simplest explanation is usually the explanation that is going to suffice. So if it takes 4 different people to pull off an event, or one can actually do the event, I'm more inclined to look for one suspect than 4. But there are times when conspiracies are successful, and I've identified when that usually occurs, there are successful elements to conspiracies, and I've had to work conspiracies a lot. I just since I wrote the book, I actually had a far better example of this pop up in my own work experience with a homicide that occurred, in 2012 in our city, and we were able to. It was a conspiracy where more than 2 people were involved in committing a murder, and we had to break the conspiracy, and we knew that we had to use some of these principles that we talk about in the book. What is it that makes a successful conspiracy? If we just work against those principles, you're usually going to be able to break them. And I've identified 5 things that I think make it possible for conspirators to get away with their crime. And typically, it's going to require, number 1, a very small number of conspirators. Obviously, if 5 people are involved in a crime, it's a lot harder for 5 to stay quiet over time than it is for, say, 2. So if you've got 2, that's a better conspirator, more likely to succeed than with, say, 5 or 6 or 7 or 12. Also, you need to have really good communication between the co-conspirators. So at some point, they're going to be challenged, and when they're challenged, you need to know what your co-conspirator is telling the authorities, so you can make sure you tell them the same thing. Because only so much of your story can be kind of settled in advance. A lot of the narrative is going to be push and pull based on what the investigator is asking you, and you really need to know what the other guy is saying in order to be successful in this. And 3, you need to be able to hold on to this for a short period of time. If you've got to hold on to this with constant testing for a longer period of time, there's more likely you're going to stumble and make a mistake in front of the investigator or in front of the person who's challenging you. And so, for example, a great conspiracy is where you've got 2 guys who go out and do a crime together, and then as soon as they finish doing the crime, one guy kills the other guy. Great. Small number of conspirators, a very short period of time that it has to be held before it's over. But so the time span is important. But also, significant relationships between conspirators does make it harder for me to break it. If I've got a father and son, they're far more likely to say to me, I'm not going to talk to you, period. Nothing you can say to me is going to compel me to talk to you, because he knows that his son is the one who's going to get in trouble if he says anything. So that's an important issue also. And finally, the less pressure that's applied to a conspiracy, the better the odds are that the conspiracy is going to survive. So if no one's asking the 2 guys who did a crime what happened, then of course it's going to go on forever, right, until somebody gives it up. So these are the elements I'm looking for in successful conspiracies. Now, I'll give you an example, and we have time to talk about it. Yeah, go. The case from last year that we had where 2 guys were involved in a murder. And we had some idea who one of them might be. And my coworkers, my younger guys who I work with, said, let's go out and arrest this guy and talk to him. I thought, no, hang on. The murder occurred tonight. We don't need to run out and make the arrest tonight. Let's do this instead. Let's put our surveillance team on that guy for the next 3 days and see what he does. Because I knew we were going to need some information in order to break the conspiracy. We had good reason at the crime scene to believe that more than one person might be involved in this murder. So taking one guy to jail, not knowing who the other outstanding parties are, is only going to get us so far, especially if he doesn't talk to us. So let's wait, let's watch and see who he's hanging out with, all that kind of stuff. So we put a surveillance team on it, and for a couple of days they watch the one suspect, and they see him connect with a couple of other people, and eventually they figure out who his best buddy is. And I told them, when you take him to jail, you have another unit come and make the arrest, don't let them know they've been watched. I don't want them to know that a surveillance team is taking them to jail. I want them to think a patrol unit is taking them to jail. Fine. That happens. Now we get them in custody. Now I separate them right away, because what I told you is, number 1, needs a low number of conspirators, and here they only had 2, so that part they had down. But thorough and consistent communication between conspirators is important. So the first thing I do is separate the 2. So one does not know what the other one is telling me. And what do you think the first thing I did was? I went to the first guy, and I told him everything that our surveillance team had watched him do with the other guy from the point of the murder almost to the last few minutes before we arrested him. 3 days of activity that I could recount to him, but I didn't tell him that our surveillance team saw it. I told him that the other guy told me all that stuff.
So the other guy you've made it seem like the other guy's turned on him, so he better now give up information to save himself.
Now, I'm lying to him. I'm allowed to do that as a police officer in this kind of a situation, and I do that. And now he thinks the other guy's already given up, and because he does not have communication with the other guy, he's not able to confirm. Did you tell this guy this? I mean, he seems to know stuff that only we knew. Mm-hmm. So how did he know that if you didn't tell him? Mm-hmm. And so now, of course, he's going to give me another little piece of the puzzle. I'm going to go back to the first guy now and give him everything I told the second guy rather, and tell him everything I told the first guy plus the 10% the first guy told me, and tell this guy that it all came from that guy. You do that a few times, before long, this thing breaks down pretty quickly because each person thinks the other guy is ratting him off because he has no way to communicate with the other person to know if this is the case or not. So what you had here was the longer we play it, the longer we push it, and the more pressure we applied. If you don't tell us the truth, you're going to go to jail and he's going to walk. So we basically work in reverse of these 5 principles. They had the first principle wired to conspirators only, but we owned number 2. We had the communication. They didn't have it. We extended this as long as we needed to, so they didn't have the short time span they would like to have. And they had no significant relationship other than being friends. And finally, we applied pressure, that the idea that he might go to jail while the other guy walks was enough pressure for us. Eventually, one of them said, okay, here's what happened. And we broke the conspiracy.
To have a good conspiracy, let's just review this for our audience. And this is all in Jim's book. J. Warner Wallace is the name. Cold Case Christianity. And in the book, he says there are 5 things that you need to have for a good conspiracy. You got to have a small number of conspirators, thorough and immediate communication, a short time span, significant relational connections, so people don't tend to rat one another out, and you have to have little or no pressure. Turns out, Jim, in the case you just broke, they had a more of an ability to hold a conspiracy together. They had more elements of a good conspiracy than the New Testament apostles did. How so?
Yeah, exactly. That's what it comes down to. Now, we talk about, and let me just back up for a second. I've talked about in the first part of the book the difference between possible and reasonable.
Yes.
Remember, anything and everything is possible, but not everything is reasonable. And in a court of law, we tell jurors you're not to go into the jury room and speculate about possibilities. You're only to infer from the evidence to come to reasonable conclusions about what happened. So if you ask me, is it possible that the 12 apostles could conspire to do this? I will always tell you yes, but it's not reasonable. And possible doesn't matter because it's possible we're not even having this conversation. It's possible we're dreaming this entire thing. Anything and everything is possible. That doesn't matter at all in a court of law or even in how you should think about the past. What matters is what's reasonable. And looking at the conspiracy idea, the idea that the 12 people separated by thousands of miles without they can't text each other, they can't get on the internet and see what the other guy's saying on Facebook. I mean, they have no way to talk to each other, and they've got to hold this for nearly 60 years. And they are definitely some brothers in the 12. But what does Matthew have in this? Why would he care what happens to Thomas? I mean, how does he even know if Thomas has given it up? How does he know if any of them have given it up? You see the problem here? They lack the elements necessary. And in terms of pressure, these folks were willing to die for what they said occurred. And they have faced the most pressure. We don't put our suspects into that kind of pressure. They face pressure like no other. So you're right. In every single one of these aspects we talked about, in the case I just described, it turns out the 12 faced odds that were much more difficult, faced factors that were much more difficult than most people face in conspiracies.
And there's a lot more of this kind of comparison between what Jim is doing every day in cold case work to the New Testament. So we're just covering just the surface of these things on this radio program right now. That's why you need to get the book Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace, Wallace. You can get it on Amazon. You can go to his website, Please Convince Me. Can you get it on your website, Jim?
Yeah, actually, we designed a website called coldcasechristianity.com, and I blog in there now every day, just some issues related to some of the questions that come up in the book. And also, we link in the sidebar there to where you can buy them. But you're right. I mean, it's Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's everywhere now. So this is a new experience for me, Frank. I mean, I'm a guy who has worked, for all these years as a cop, and now trying to figure out, navigate this entire new adventure as an author is I'm learning as I go. But yeah, we did design a website that will help people, I think, find the book.
Well, it's well worth getting, ladies and gentlemen. You need to get the book. And as I say, you can also check Jim out and his speaking engagements. You can get him as a speaker. You can see his podcast or hear his podcasts and see his blog posts at pleaseconvinceme.com. So I highly encourage you to get out there and do this. Again, this is a kind of a unique thing. I don't know if anybody else has done this before. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think anyone else has done this kind of book before, Jim, where you're going through really a good analysis of how to detect what good evidence is. And then you go on in the second half of the book and apply it to the New Testament. We haven't even gotten there yet because there's so much in the first half that we need to talk about. And in fact, when we come back from the break, we're going to talk more about that. But before I do, I want to point out one other thing. Part of being a detective is going to the sites themselves and to see what kind of physical evidence is left behind. Yeah. And we're going to do that this summer like we did last summer. Me and my friend Bob Cornuke, the real Indiana Jones, are going to go on another Footsteps of Paul cruise this summer and lead it. In addition, however, we're going to go to the Holy Land and be in Israel for 4 days. And this is going to be another phenomenal trip. We'll start in Israel on May 27th, and then we'll fly to Istanbul on June 1st, and then do the Footsteps of Paul. We're going to hit Troas. We're going to hit Ephesus. We're going to hit Athens. We're going to hit Corinth. Man, when we were in Corinth this past July, it was just unbelievable to actually stand in the same place Paul stood when he was on trial before Gallio, right there in Corinth. To stand at the Bema seat was just amazing. To see all these other sites, you can't describe it until you go there and stand there for yourself. And so, as I say, we're going to do this for Paul. We're going to do this for Jesus by being in the Holy Land. Go to our website, crossexamined.org, for more information. If you really want to dive in and see a little video on it, we have it on our website. We also have it on the individuals who are organizing the trip for it, and their website is livingpassages.com. That's livingpassages.com. Check it out there. It's going to be a phenomenal trip. It really was an experience for me like no other last year. I can't wait to do it again. I hope you guys can join us. So check it out. More, by the way, with my friend J. Warner Wallace and his book Cold Case Christianity in just 2 minutes. Don't go away. Back in 2. What's the evidence for the New Testament events? Do they stand up to scrutiny, strict scrutiny, like one would have in, say, a court of law? Well, my guest today, J. Warner Wallace, who is a cold case homicide detective with the Torrance, California Police Department, says yes. And he's written a new book called Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. Now, my guest, J. Warner Wallace, was not a Christian. He was an atheist till he was 35 years old. So he's not, it appears to me, it doesn't have a biased perspective, like he was just brought up to believe this. He was actually against it, and he looked at the evidence and came to the conclusion that the New Testament events are true. Now, Jim, explain the difference to our audience between, say, direct evidence and circumstantial evidence, because I always hear the atheists saying, well, you don't have any real good direct evidence for God.
Yeah, and I get so tired of that myself because I think that I've never had a case that I didn't make on a completely, especially these cold cases. Uh-huh. All of my cases are 100% circumstantial. And in other words, the kinds of evidence I'm using are circumstantial, categorized as circumstantial or indirect evidence, not direct evidence. The difference basically is this. About the only thing that qualifies as direct evidence is an eyewitness who comes in and says, I saw him shoot her. You know, I saw him. I've known him for 30 years. He walked over there. He pointed the gun at her. He shot her. He came over to me. He was wearing a shirt that I gave him for his birthday 2 years ago. And then he said to me, Jim, I never liked her. And he walked out. So he used my name on the way out the door. That's pretty compelling. You get a guy who's basically saying that he knows this suspect well enough to have known him for all those years, gave him the shirt he's wearing, for crying out loud. He talked to him by name. If you had somebody walk into a courtroom and tell you that one piece of direct evidence, the testimony of this one witness, might be enough for you to say, hey, that's pretty convincing. Now, circumstantial evidence or indirect evidence is very different. It requires many more pieces to make the same point. But I'll give you an example. Everything else qualifies has to be evaluated circumstantially. So, for example, people will sometimes say, well, how about DNA? Isn't DNA direct evidence? Isn't a fingerprint direct evidence? Well, if a suspect's DNA is found on a victim at a crime scene, and they're that one's a woman, the victim's a woman, and the suspect's a guy, and you say, well, that's pretty compelling. His DNA is on her body. Well, he says to you, wait a minute, we've been boyfriend and girlfriend living together for the last 5. Of course my DNA is there. I'm with her every night. Suddenly the circumstance has mitigated the power of that DNA. Now, on the other hand, if he said, I've never known this one. I've never met her. I've never been to her house. I've never even seen this woman before. Now, that's a different circumstance, and it makes that DNA all that much more powerful. You see, everything other than eyewitness testimony ends up being largely circumstantial. And that's why I think we would, in order to say, hey, I can't accept, as a matter of fact, jurors are instructed by judges in California to evaluate circumstantial evidence at the exact same value level as direct evidence. You're not to look at the circumstantial evidence and say, oh, that's just circumstantial evidence. No, in fact, it's to be considered as having the same probative value, the same value in a courtroom. And that's very important for us to remember, because the case for Christianity is built on many lines of evidence that point to the same conclusion. The more lines of evidence point to the same conclusion in a circumstantial case, the more confidence you can have that you've arrived at the right decision. As a matter of fact, Frank, I tell people this all the time. I like circumstantial cases better than direct evidence cases because direct evidence, witnesses, can lie to you.
Mm-hmm.
Circumstantial evidence will never intentionally, you can misunderstand it, you can misinterpret it, but it does not intentionally try to deceive you. That's why we spent time in the second half of the book saying, okay, look, if all these principles about evidence work a certain way, and now we're saying that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts, how do we know that they're not lying to us? See, we still get to evaluate eyewitnesses. We have a criteria for doing so. And we take that template. That's one of the things we try to teach in the first part of the book. We take that criteria and we apply it to the eyewitness accounts of the Gospels, and we try to see, do they pass the muster we would offer. And let me just say one last thing about that before we move on. I often get this thing, Vincent Bugliosi, who tried the Charles Manson case back in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. He was a prosecutor who wrote a book called Divinity of Doubt. And he talks about how you could never trust the gospel accounts. They're all ancient accounts. You can't cross-examine the eyewitnesses. It's hearsay. It would never stand in the court of law. Well, that's true, because we have a very high standard. We have to be able to cross-examine witnesses. But if he applied the criminal standard to any event of history, every event of history would be disqualified. As a matter of fact, the history of the Charles Manson case would be disqualified because many of those witnesses are now dead and cannot be cross-examined. So we have to apply a different standard for hearsay related to historical events than we apply to criminal trials, and that's a natural. We all recognize that intuitively. To claim that we must take the exact same template is ridiculous. So I just wanted to throw that out in case people have a question about that.
Now, is it fair to say when it comes to the New Testament events, we have both direct and circumstantial, because we have the eyewitness evidence and then circumstantial evidence, correct?
Yeah, and this is how crazy circumstantial cases are. You end up building a circumstantial case for almost everything. You do it, and I do it every day. Our kid comes home late, and it's got to put a story in the book about a partner of mine who used to always tell me that he would run up to his son. He'd wait up for his son to come home, and as soon as his son walked in through the door, he'd get up off the couch and he'd walk over to his son and give him a big hug and a kiss on the cheek and say, "Hey, I'm going to bed now. I'm glad you're home safe." And I used to think, this guy was such an old salty dog. Really, I could not imagine him doing this with his son. And he would tell me, well, I'm not stupid here. Come on. I'm walking up and making sure I don't smell alcohol in him or smell smoking dope. Whatever I'm getting close enough where I can examine the evidence so I know he's not doing something he shouldn't do. And that's what we do. We assemble circumstantial cases. So even when we're trying to determine, are the eyewitness gospel writers reliable, we can do it by assembling a circumstantial case to test their reliability. So we have to use principles of circumstantial evidence even when we are examining direct evidence for its reliability.
And you do so beautifully. The book, by the way, is called Cold Case Christianity, for those just tuning in. The author, J. Warner Wallace, Wallace. You need to get this book. It's unique. There's nothing else like it out there. It's brand new. Just came out this January 2013. And you have a chapter in here I want to harbor on, or I want to marinate on for just a minute, Jim. It's chapter 9. It's called The Principle Know When Enough is Enough. It's one of the 10 principles you lay out to know what good evidence is. And you make a distinction here. You briefly talked about it before, reasonable versus possible doubts. A lot of people out there think they just can't be a Christian because it's possible it isn't true. Can you comment on that? Yeah, I mean, every case, I don't care what kind of a case you're making on what kind of a topic. If it's a case about what your worldview, your foundational theistic or atheistic worldview, or it's a case on what your kid was doing out late last night,
every case is built with, and there's always some unanswered questions.
Mm-hmm.
I've never had a case in which some questions are simply not answerable. The only way you could answer that question would be if the suspect was to cop out to the whole thing, and he's not doing that. So there are some, how did he get the body off that scene? What did he do with the victim's car? Lots of questions. And how did he have time to get that done the way he did it? Look, we're not going to be able to answer some of those questions. And we asked jurors, if you're the kind of person that has to have every question answered before you can come to a decision, if you can't have any doubts at all, even possible doubts, and tell us now, because if that's the way you're coming at this, we appreciate your service and you're going to be excused, because we cannot put jurors on juries that have that ridiculously high standard of I have to be convinced beyond any possible doubt. That is not the standard of proof, the SOP. Now, the SOP varies depending on the kind of case you're working, but the most rigorous SOP is the rigorous SOP we use in criminal trials, which is the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. That's the highest level of requirement of proof. And what that means basically is this. Remember, possible is anything you can imagine, and reasonable is what can be inferred from the evidence presented. So I had a case once where I had a murderer. A guy murdered his wife because she was able to. They were fighting over about $40,000 or $50,000 of his retirement, and he did not want to give it to her. And she finally was clever enough to be able to get this through the sale of the house. And I did that without telling him. And then he discovered the house was sold on a Wednesday. He discovered that he lost this money on a Thursday. He killed her on Friday. And when he did this murder, we caught him years later and brought him to trial. And the defense suggested that it was possible that this was a burglary that had gone bad. The husband is not responsible for this. This was a botched burglary. Didn't realize that the victim was home, makes an entry into the house, and had to kill her. Well, we asked, is there any evidence of a forced entry here? Is there any evidence that anything has been taken from the house or that anyone has been in this house other than the suspect and the victim? Is there any evidence that there's a rash of burglaries in the neighborhood lately? You don't have any of that kind of evidence. So to go into the jury room and speculate about the possibility of a burglary is simply out of bounds. You might have a doubt. You might even say, "Isn't it? It's possible there's a burglary gone bad." Put that on the whiteboard in the jury room and ask yourself, is this based on the reasonable inference from evidence, or is it just your imagination working overtime, or just a possible concern you have, but it's not grounded in any evidence presented to you at the trial? If it falls in that category, not grounded on evidence that's presented in the trial, you can disregard it. That's a possible doubt, but it's not a reasonable doubt, because reasonable doubts are grounded in the inferences from evidence.
Gary Habermas has said that skeptics of the New Testament need to provide evidence for their possibilities, not just possibilities. And you say basically the same thing here. They talk about hallucinations. They talk about Jesus substituted, like the Muslims say somebody was substituted for Jesus on the cross. He never died. Yeah. They come up, Jesus had a twin brother. I mean, all these.
Yeah, no, I got to tell you, Frank, when I'm asked those kinds of questions on the stand, Detective Wallace, isn't it possible that blah, some possibility? I always say the same thing, and I say it quickly. Yes, it's possible, because anything's possible, but it's not reasonable. I always say the whole sentence, so they want to strike the last part. But the point is, if you were to ask me as a skeptic, isn't it possible that Jesus didn't die on the cross? Absolutely. It's not reasonable, but it's possible, because anything's possible. That's how I usually respond. And so
you say on page one... No, go ahead. Go ahead, Jim.
Any of those kinds of doubts that people have or skeptical challenges that people have, I am very quick to suggest or to admit that these are definitely possible. The only problem is possible doesn't count. Possible is anything and everything. Only thing that matters. And they would say this practically in their own lives, in their own marriages, in their own raising of their own kids. They've always camped on what's reasonable alone. They want others to examine their own lives based on what's reasonable, not what's possible. So let's be fair to the Gospels. Let's examine them on the basis of what's reasonable and not what's possible, because all of a sudden, is it possible that Jim's actually a bank robber in the other county and I do that every other day? Of course it is. But I don't want you to camp on that possibility. It's not reasonable. You know where I was yesterday. I was with you. So this is the whole point. Let's take that same standard and apply it to each other.
Well, you know what's reasonable? This book, Cold Case Christianity, you need to get it. The author, J. Warner Wallace. Jim, thanks for being on the show.
Hey, I so appreciate you, Frank. Thanks for having me.
It's a great book, friends. Get it and tune in next time. I'll see you here next time. I'm Frank Turek. God bless. See you.
Cross-Examine with Dr.